What I wanted to focus on was very much around the role of institutional stakeholders in open access workflows. So we've talked a lot today about how to work with publishers, or how you can't work with publishers, as the case may be. I want to, in a sense, take a more internal view of the open access process and fathom out how we're actually making this work within our own institutions, in terms of how we as libraries seek to carry out open access, manage open access, but do it in the context of working with our colleagues within our institution as part of research workflows generally. So to cover, why are we interested in this? Open access, and look at a couple of the projects that have helped stimulate this thinking and within which this work took place. The situation at HUL and at Glasgow briefly, but by way of demonstrating that there is a variety of different ways of actually carrying out this work. We're not advocating in any way that there is a single option, a single way of doing this. There is not by any means. And then to look at the outcomes of a survey that I carried out towards the end of last year, looking at how people have engaged with the other institutional stakeholders within their institutions in order to make open access work, or in a couple of cases not, as the case may be. And then end with some conclusions and next steps. So in terms of background, the way we became interested in this was by trying to understand that if we want open access to work, we have to recognise that open access is an integral part of the research workflow, or at least can be if researchers are aware of it and are open to it in that sense. But it's about research dissemination. It's about getting researchers to think about different ways in which they can disseminate their research. But if we can make it part of the way they think about their research workflows generally, then that's a way of trying to embed open access longer term. And to my mind, from my perspective, it's all very well saying that as a library we can do open access for you as a researcher. If they don't start thinking about it as being part of their research workflow, then it's going to be very difficult for them to actually take it on board as something they consider as a viable option in the long term. Libraries do play a very key role in advocating and managing open access. But the question remains is, how do they then work with other stakeholders within the institution, other professional services and academics themselves, in order to make sure that open access isn't necessarily just seen as a library activity, however much value that may provide to the library in terms of responsibility and reputation. Is open access a library responsibility, or should it be an institutional one? Coupled with that, if we're thinking about how we work with those institutional stakeholders, then, and we believe that open access is key to the way the research ought to operate, or research dissemination ought to operate in our institutions, how do we actually then reflect that within strategy statements within our universities in order to actually say this is a vital, very important part of how we should operate? So the background came out of the Pathfinder projects that you may be aware of, and maybe some of you are involved in, that the Jisc has been operating for the last couple of years. 9 projects which are involving a larger number of institutions across the country, looking at good practice in open access and producing a very wide range of materials that are highlighting ways in which you can operate, ways in which you can make open access work as well as it possibly can do. I've been leading the HHuLOA project between Hull, Huddersfield and Lincoln, and Valerie's been leading the end-to-end open access project from Glasgow, which has involved Lancaster, Southampton and Kent. So a wide range of institutions, even within those 2 projects, looking at open access and trying to make it work. And we both had a specific interest in open access workflows and how we can make them work as effectively as possible. So just to talk about our background in Hull, we lead on open access, particularly around advocacy and management within the institution, and that for us actually was a follow-on because we were the lead in implementation of the institutional repository, although our primary use case for the repository was not open access, but it's the one followed on from the other. We have an open access policy which was adopted by the University Research Committee, so there was that institutional buy-in at that level, and we managed that through an open access working group. We have research support colleagues who are supportive of open access, but by and large they're happy to let the library just get on and do it for the most part. Although it has to be said our ref manager is incredibly keen on the idea because of the HEFCE policy, which is maybe not so surprising. The best lever for us has been actually working with our Associate Deans for Research and the communication channel that they have out to the academic staff. Glasgow, similar but different. The library leads on open access, but they have, in a sense, whereas we manage it with a very small number of staff within the university, within the library, Glasgow's tried to sort of involve a range of people from across the library because of the different skills, the different roles that they have in actually facilitating the open access workflow. Glasgow, I suppose, were early on adopters of a publications policy as opposed to an open access policy, have not seen fit to necessarily have to revamp that because it's worked very well for them over the time since they've had it. They likewise have had buy-in from a high-level member of senior management within the institution, which has greatly helped and drive forward open access, and also have supportive research support colleagues and a fully engaged ref manager. I'd be surprised if there isn't a ref manager who isn't fully engaged in open access across the country at the moment, mind you, but still. And their best lever has been to actually provide a value-added service, a one-stop shop for academics, so that they can see what the service they're getting is, so they can make use of that in the most effective way they can. So the key between that is that we highlighted in our discussions that I've got the view that it would be great to actually be more proactive in working with research support colleagues. In a sense at Glasgow, because they've been doing it for so long, it works. They've managed to get that relationship working very well. For my part, it's sort of still a process in transition, I suppose. So the upshot of that was, we've got slightly different but similar scenarios, different relationships between the different people we work with within our institutions. What is the broader picture? It interested in us to understand, well, where are people coming from more generally? So we carried out a survey towards the end of last year, as I mentioned, and that was to find out what is the current interaction between libraries and other parts of the institution in supporting open access, to understand how open access is being managed now and how it could be managed in the future by asking people where did they think that role was going to sit in a couple of years' time, and then also to get a flavour of how many people are trying to embed open access within their institutional strategies at one level or another. Okay, so it was just before Christmas. We got 47 respondents, but it was a good spread, 43 institutions across the country, and that included 13 RLUK members. We did actually get 2 US contributors, which wasn't actually intentional, but it was very nice of them to respond. And most of them were from the library, as you can see there, but we also got a fair amount of response from faculty, department research support, central research support, and it was due to have their voice expressed in this, because it meant that it wasn't just the library perspective, but that was very deliberate. We got a couple of others, including, given it was mentioned, the Office of Scholarly Communication. So Danny, thank you very much for your response to the survey. But the reason I picked that out is because one thing that struck me about the US is that they always have these way of framing something and giving it importance is by creating an office of something. And actually that strikes me as maybe a very powerful way of demonstrating the value of something within an institution more generally. One byproduct of the survey was that I simply asked people what their job titles were. And picking up on the point about language and how different people use different language for open access, and that potentially is a source of some confusion, I looked through the job titles of the people who responded to this survey, and they were all by and large people who were operating with open access at some level in their institution, and was quite frightened by the number of words that were encompassed within those job titles. And it did occur to me that maybe one of the issues that we have in advocating open access is that people can't quite fathom out what our job titles are supposed to be doing across our institutions. But that's a matter for discussion over drinks, I suspect. So just a bit of background to the people who did respond. We did have, they were engaged people, so the majority actually had an open access policy in place. And actually, half of those did actually have joint responsibility for that policy, so they had been working together with their research support colleagues already. So in that sense, it was quite an interesting positive picture coming back that highlighted that this engagement was actually quite active in a number of institutions across the country already. At the same time, by far, the majority of people who managed open access was in the library, as I think we all realise. The responses varied tremendously from very high-level management, involving senior university management, right through to a very strongly worded claim that nobody managed open access at all. It just happened in some way, shape or form. A lot of those policies had been driven by HEFCE, or at least have been rewritten as a result of HEFCE. Some were still preparing a policy because they felt they needed one because of the hefty policy and needed to have a way of rolling something out across the institution. Some of them were open access specific. Some of them, like the Glasgow one, were actually more general because people thought there was actually more value in actually encompassing open access in something that referred to publications more generally or around research dissemination more generally. And clearly the library acts as a real catalyst in getting this going because most of the policies had been library-led, but there had been that engagement with other parts of the institution in order to get that buy-in, and the policy was quite often owned by a number of different parts of the institution, not just by the library instead. And half of them were registered in RAWMAP. Now, the value of RAWMAP, I suppose, is a matter of personal opinion, but there's an awful lot of open access policies listed there. It's a very valuable source of information, certainly around how people are trying to implement open access within their institutions. In terms of open access fund management, 33 of them actually did have a fund available, but the vast majority of those, it has to be said, were because they had RCUK or COAF funds. Very few institutions had local funding or local funds in place to complement or top that up, unfortunately. I was a bit surprised by that because my reading of the literature suggested there would be more, but the feedback suggested otherwise. Most of those were managed, or most of those were actually managed by central libraries, central research support. They weren't managed by, but the library managed with the second bunch, second highest number of people to manage those. So, in a sense, that sort of highlighted that the library's got a very clear role in pushing forward open access, but in terms of actually managing the money, that's not necessarily everywhere where always their responsibility. Now, I realised graphs, end of the day, survey presentation, never great to actually stare at lots of graphs, but the whole point of these is to highlight trends. So the idea of the survey was to ask people in a bit more detail, well, okay, so who carries out the role in this specific part of the workflow? We looked at a whole range of stages of the workflow from the beginning, which is how do you actually advocate open access, right through to how do you actually measure statistics or measure the impact of open access further down the line. And who does it now, and where do you think that role is going to sit in a couple of years' time? So as regards a couple of the most obvious ones that libraries involve in, which is open access APC management and open access advocacy, I think the thing that struck me about those was that there was a perception that in 2 years' time, more people in the institution should be engaged in that activity, and it shouldn't just be the library. Clearly, the library is going to be the primary provider, but other than that, the responders to this survey felt that this was activity that should actually be spread out across the institution instead. So in terms of, not surprisingly maybe given the responders to the survey, since most of them were from the library, the survey results highlighted that the following areas of workflow were key library strengths: advocacy, guidance, APC management, deposit, metadata, embargo management, statistics, discovery, validation, impact monitoring. The library had a very active role in all of those right across the board. At the same time, in the areas highlighted in red, there was a similar feeling that these were areas where actually it would be great, let's get more people across the institution involved, let's get more stakeholders involved, because this isn't necessarily something that we as a library should be the only ones doing. I suppose noticeable, the three areas were the three areas you might consider to be major library strengths. It's about, well, no one actually thought anyone was going to take deposits off the library. We're going to have to carry on doing that. But metadata and embargo management also was still very much considered to be library activities. But all the others, can we involve central research support more? Can we involve faculty research support more? Can we involve other parts of the institution more in order to get them involved? So again, sort of graphs highlighting this. So in terms of statistics gathering, looking at those four, these are four areas of post-publication activity. So in terms of gathering open access statistics, looking to sort of the purple bars are the ones where we're looking at 2 years' time. So more activity for other parts of the institution, less in the library. Open access discovery, actually making sure that open access articles are discovered properly through the routes through which we wish to expose them. Predominantly still the library, but trying to sort of involve research support more. Open access validation. Are the publishers actually doing what they say they're going to do? Because we've got lots of evidence that they don't. Again, trying to sort of spread that out, get people more involved in that area. And likewise, open access impact monitoring, getting more people involved in actually doing that for themselves and embedding that open access within that activity. Oddly enough, though, libraries did seem to, or the responses were that libraries should be more involved in the management of the research information system, and I suspect that comes from wanting to have more control over how outputs are managed within that, where there is a research information system. And also the response was that they should be more involved in ref management. I mean, slightly, not much more, but it was intriguing that these were institutional processes which don't necessarily start off within the library, but there was a clear response that it was important that the library should look to try and get a bit more involved in these going forward. Going back to the beginning, the other thing that struck me about these results were that when it comes to actually advocating or putting open access in grant applications, the library is certainly involved to some degree, about 20% of respondents. There's been no suggestion that open access libraries should get more involved in that side of open access. The intriguing thing that strikes me about that is that much as we advocate open access is going to work. Part of embedding open access is by getting researchers to reflect in their grant applications that they are going to take advantage of open access, that they're going to apply for funds in order to use open access, or they're going to make sure they disseminate in an open access way. And it's an interesting sort of separation, I suppose, is that we talk about, if we're going to advocate open access in a generic way, that we're not necessarily looking to maybe get more involved in the grant application process and making sure that part of that advocacy is getting that open access into those grant applications in the first place. And that can underpin subsequent activity and subsequent embedding. So, how did those arrangements get in place? So we wanted to also ask, well, how did you actually get open access to where you are now? So very pleasingly, it was nice to see that it was part of a coordinated effort within the institution in a good number of institutions, often driven by external drivers like the RCUK, COAF funder policies and HEFCE policy. Often driven by setting up an institutional repository, that was a catalyst, and likewise getting permission to recruit a member of staff was a catalyst in getting the open access up and running. A lot of the activity, this was based on free text comments and expressions within those free text comments. A fair amount of mention of the organic nature of the process, which may be as a result of how our institutions work, but there was a contrast, I suppose, between those institutions that had actually done it in a very structured way and those where it had just sort of evolved over time. And I also asked, well, what would make open access work better? So internal reasons, these aren't surprising in a sense. It's about, well, getting better academic engagement and compliance, better IT systems, which maybe doesn't say a huge amount for the repositories and systems that we have, but it depends on the institution and situation, I suppose. More staff because of the workload, better workflows and internal management. All those things we've come across before, I suppose. External, clarity from publishers, not surprisingly, and clarity from funders as well. Key to me then about, well, if we want OA to work better, and we recognise those internal reasons, then how can we actually raise the profile of open access institutionally in order to be able to provide some backing, some oomph behind addressing those points? And that led on to the next part of the investigation, which was about, well, how is open access embedded within your strategies? Now, I realise, of course, this makes a huge assumption that if you embed something in a strategy, then more people will pay attention to it. So that may vary itself, but as a way of getting attention to a matter, getting discussion around it, getting something mentioned in an institutional strategy of some sort is a common way of raising the level of discussion about it. So, 55% of the respondents did have open access mentioned in one of their strategies, mostly within a research strategy or a library strategy, some of them within a university strategy as well, the blue segment there. If it wasn't mentioned in a strategy, it tended to have been at the sort of next level down, which was in guides for good research practice or research practice documentation, or slightly more specific or other types of strategy that that institution happened to have. So quite a split there between whether people did or not. How did that come about? Well, quite a lot of feedback that said, well, it meant going through the committees. And of course, we all know our institutions work by virtue of committees. It's about plodding through those and getting through them. But sometimes that can take quite a lot of time. And given what we mentioned earlier, sometimes are we in a position where we have that time? We want to push ahead with something. Pleasingly, where there had been good mention of open access in those strategies, that had usually come about through an activity that involved collaborative working between the library and other stakeholders, either through collaborative work on the OA policy, or the outcome of an institutional open access group, or through just simply close working and then advocacy to senior management that having open access in the strategy was a good way forward. Predominantly, if people said, no, we don't, then that was quite often because of the timing of the strategy cycle. So research strategies were written 5 years ago when it wasn't a priority. So they're looking to try and get them more embedded there. And for many people, it was in the pipeline. But there was a certain amount of, well, I'm not quite sure whether that's ever going to happen institutionally. So the clear benefits that we got from this were recognised were clearly the higher visibility, and also just increasing the university awareness and buy-in. But that then does lead to the case of, well, if we get that increased level of awareness and buy-in, then how can that be used to help address those issues that were highlighted as about how to make open access better? Slightly more concerningly, as a number of people felt, well, I'm not quite sure what the point of having open access in an institutional strategy was. So one of the things we asked people about was, well, what do you think would actually, what would you actually want to promote in an institutional strategy about open access? So we asked them, well, was it about financial benefit, about the dissemination benefit, the legal benefit in terms of open licensing, the technical benefits of how do you use technology to make open access work, using open access as part of the generic open scholarship, open science case, or actually simply making, as an institution, wanting to be recognised as a contributor to the openness agenda, nationally or internationally. Intriguingly, one thing I found struck, we had 47 respondents to this survey. I got 149 suggestions of why it was a good idea to have this as part of an institutional strategy. So clearly people did feel that that was the case, predominantly to do with dissemination, as you might imagine, but also interestingly about being part of that open community, contributing to the open agenda more generally. So subsequently, what would help in order to help take that forward? And we got some responses, again, lots of responses to say, what would it be useful to help facilitate those links between institutional stakeholders? Predominantly people looking for good practice workflows, case studies and checklists in order to be able to understand what they should be doing. In terms of assistance and inclusion in institutional strategies, again, people looking for good practice guidelines, case studies, and senior manager advocacy, as you might imagine. So, conclusions to draw out of those. In many ways, like a lot of surveys I read, what this did is confirm a lot of things that I assume might be the case already. But it was nice to have the feedback in order to put some meat behind that. There seemed to be a desire for open access workload to be more spread out across the institution over a period of time. Now, I don't know whether that was because people simply felt that they had too much work and therefore they wanted to get rid of it or spread it out, or whether they actually saw a benefit of embedding. That's something that would need to be tested further. But given that the library has a predominant role for open access within the institution, is there a question about to what extent does the library want to maintain that role? To what extent does the library wish to exercise that role? How much is open access an institutional service through which the library coordinates, manages, is the primary driver? But if there's a desire to involve other institutional stakeholders more, how is that going to happen? And how does that get coordinated, managed? It's going to vary from institution to institution, hence the desire for more assistance that I highlighted there, but something to be thinking about over those couple of years to understand how that's going to be done, so that maybe it is that controlled, structured way of doing it. It's not just the organic evolution of how our services operate within our institutions. In terms of open access making its presence felt within institutional strategies, it is, clearly, more so than I imagined. But there does seem to be a feeling that the impact of that is not yet clear, but it may be just early days. And the key benefits, which I came as a very positive to me, was about using the strategy to promote the role of the institution in open scholarship, because there's a very strategic agenda and a strategic step forward, and also the dissemination in terms of institutional impact and reputation through that dissemination. There was also a sense in which there's a lot going on, there's a lot that can be done, there's a lot happening, and therefore just get on and do it and try and move things forward probably quicker than our institutions would maybe like us to, but there's a weight behind us to get things going, to better establish open access and work with our colleagues on doing so. In terms of next steps, the projects I mentioned both have outputs. We'll be focusing on a checklist. I know the abstract for this talk talked about developing an MOU, but the response we got back from the survey was not much interest in that. But a checklist is something that we were going to use in order to frame an MOU anyway, so we'll be focusing on that. End-to-end open access is focusing on good practice workflows and experience, but in general, I would refer you to the outputs from the Pathfinder projects, because there's lots of workflows, there's lots of case studies, there's lots of presentation materials, all of which came up as things that people would like to see and use in order to inform their own developments. And clearly we'll be feeding back to Jisc through the programme about advocacy to senior managers going forward. What came out is that the more we share our experiences, the better we can embed open access. And therefore I would like to urge everyone to find a way of sharing what you are doing at the moment. And now I realise there's a sort of test bed there, because a lot of people feel a bit nervous about sharing something they're not quite sure is working as well as it could do. So how happy are we to be open about how we are being open? Let's in a sense, live what we're trying to put into practice and share what we're doing at the moment so that we can all learn from each other and make it better. Thank you.